You can tag this link and send it to all of your friends and family members and let them know or invite them to come and be a part of tonight's discussion. And then also, toward the end of our discussion on tonight, we're going to allow an opportunity for you, the viewer, to raise questions to all of those who are part of our panel on tonight. And so right in the comment section, if you're joining us via social media, via Facebook, there is where we're going to check for all of the questions. So again, as a viewer, we want you to get involved, and we certainly want you to take part. So right now, real quick again, go ahead and click the share button. Go ahead and start a watch party so that, again, we can spread the word and invite as many people as possible to come so that we can all hear our discussion tonight in what we call a crucial discussion, policing here in the capital city. I am excited because I want to introduce to you on tonight all of our panel participants. We have some amazing men and women that is joining us on tonight. And so I'm going to begin to introduce them from my left, your right. Will you help me welcome them as I call each of them by name? He is a neighborhood association president and community leader. Welcome to you, Mr. Patrick Moss. She is an attorney and partner in the law firm Miller and Smith, LLC. Will you help me welcome attorney Ashley Smith? He is a community leader and newly retired pastor. He is our pastor emeritus, Pastor Ed Nettles Sr. We also have with us, he is the senior pastor of the First Christian Church, also a community leader and community activist. We welcome you tonight, Pastor Shane Eisner. We also have Deputy Health Officer for the Jefferson County Health Department, Dr. David Hicks. Welcome. And finally, we have Senior Pastor of the New Home Baptist Church, also a great community leader and a great brother, Pastor Lee B. Walker Jr. Welcome. Tonight, we also will have joining us, the city never sleeps, and the work of a police chief never dies, never ends, I guess I should say. We also will have joining us very soon the Chief of Police for the city of Montgomery, Chief Ernest Finley Jr. And so as he is en route to where we are on tonight, again, we are going to go ahead and get started. But again, this is an event that we are excited to, again, partner with the Montgomery Police Department in celebration and highlighting this weekend of Faith in Blue. And so because this is a weekend that's centered around faith, we're going to start tonight with a very essential component of the faith community, and that is through prayer. And so leading us in prayer tonight is Pastor Shane Eisner. Pastor Eisner.
Thank you, Pastor Bird. Will you all please be in prayer with me? Holy God of each of us, of every family, of every church, of every community, we praise you, for indeed we are fearfully and wonderfully made, known, accepted, loved by you, who are our beginning, our middle, and our end. Thank you. We pray tonight for the wisdom, the patience, the understanding, and empathy that it will take to know indeed how to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with you, and so make for a safer, better community for all your children, whatever they believe, look like, whomever they love, for indeed you are the God of all, who loves all, and in the name of the one who makes us one with you for always and forever, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Pastor Eisner. Let's stay with you as we go to our first question on tonight. Over the years, concern has grown that many see the relationship between the police department and the community as perhaps an us versus them type relationship. What do you believe has been some of the contributing factors to the mindset and approach that many have as it relates to an us versus them approach?
An us versus them approach. What are the factors that contribute to it? I feel like in some ways I need to call the elephant in the room out and say white supremacy has been a part of it. A worry about who it is that the police department are protecting and serving most adequately and energetically. And there might be a worry that the police might be more focused on making people who look and sound like me comfortable and safe, rather than other communities, people of color, people who are poor, etc. And so I think that might be part of it. I think there's a history of conflict that people have contributed to, and in talking about things like law and order and conversations that tend to look down on and alienate and scapegoat people in communities of color, etc. I think that gives permission, perhaps, for people to see what should be their neighbors in Montgomery as those other people, and then look to our police officers to enforce that divide, which I don't think is fair, certainly to communities who have been mistreated, nor would it be fair to the officers whose job it would be to protect and serve all of us, instead being used as a shield to make some people feel lower and some people feel more superior. I could go on about as a faith leader who believes that the fundamental story in Christianity is that our leader was scapegoated and killed and rose again to show us that, like, we don't have to do that to one another, that we don't have to create law and order on the backs of violence against people who are exploited just because of who they are or where they were born. And so I think we're called as Christians, perhaps, to live and model a better way. The Scripture says that we are called to be a light unto the world, which means that we are to shine light and love to all around us, rather than being seen as the light and have everyone stare at us and be good, think good about us. And so I would hope that we would all commit to that sense of there is no person born in a way that they should be alienated, scapegoated, or the target of attacks, and that us versus them thing. It just ain't Jesus. Fundamental, pure and simple, ain't Jesus.
Good deal. Pastor Nettles, let me go to you. Pastor Eisner mentioned this phrase, law and order. This has become a political term under the current political administration, and not to turn this into a political conversation on tonight, but when you hear this phrase, law and order, what does that phrase mean to you?
Well, for me, as an African American, law and order to me is a code word from slavery. Whenever a slave ran away from the plantation, the master sent the law and order to get him back. And so over the years, I believe that black and brown people have been underserved, underprotected, and overly harassed because of this law and order mentality. Our people need to see the other side. We know what law and order look like. We've lived it. We lived it. And so when you see, even in the political realm, I'm going to go there, and you hear these folks talking about law and order, they're talking to each other about some other folk. Okay? So the law and order is for us as a people, and I'm just not going to talk a lot, but it's we're back to your us against them mentality. And, there is a mentality in law enforcement. Say, when I was in the Marine Corps, we were taught to say, semper fidelis, and we would respond, always faithful. Code word, don't tell on each other. So the thin blue line, I want to know what that means, since I understand recognizing a fallen officer. No disrespect to fallen officers. But my issue is when you belong to an organization, are you saying we don't police each other publicly or openly within law enforcement? You know, so there's always a code, you know, and in that code, there's a belief that the police are against the community as a whole, but especially the African American community. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Nettles. I'm going to hold your comment that you raised about the thin blue line, because we're going to have a topic coming up a little bit later on that we're going to dive a little bit deeper there. Chief Finley, let me officially welcome you to tonight's discussion, and thank you so much, Chief, for coming and being a part of our time together on tonight. We know, again, that the work of a chief is endless, and so, again, we thank you so much for taking time out to join us. I want to direct this next question to you, sir. Students across the river region have received, and many of them will soon be receiving, their progress reports grading the performance during these first 9 weeks of school. What grade, sir, do you give your department's, the Montgomery Police Department's performance during these first full 9 months of the 2020 year? Chief, real quick, let's have you grab the mic. There we go. Thank you, sir.
So, grading the police department on our performance for the first 9 months. And that's that can go based on interpretation, right? So, perception is reality. So when we look at any victim of a crime is not going to be satisfied. And so we're going to have victims. Our biggest challenge the first 9 months, I would say, would be violent crime. I would say the homicides and the shootings. And so we are diligently addressing those issues, putting more resources out there, but, you know, we're going to constantly do that. And so in terms of everything else, that will be our Achilles heel, but overall, the first 9 months, crime is down about 18% overall. However, one homicide, one shooting victim is just too many, and we are having our large number of this year. However, I would say with the shootings and with the homicides that we had this year, it's not a whodunit. It's not random. It's for the most part relational, domestic, quality life issues that we need to get, have more balance, have a clearer heart as far as a lot of the reactionary shootings and spontaneous shootings and homicides that we had. But to your question, I think that we are doing a good job overall. But there's some areas that we can kind of improve in each and every day, and I think that we can. I think this is a good forum for that. I think Faith in Blue is a good forum for that. I think that any time that we can get out, we can communicate with the masses, it's a great opportunity. And I think this kind of piggyback on what Pastor Nettles said, is that the perception is realities out there on how the community feels about us. So this is that opportunity for us to kind of change that dynamic on that we are human too, that we can do things a little bit differently. So when we talk about law and order, the way I kind of phrase that will be protect and serve to be engaging, because he's right. The perception is that we are over-policing certain communities. And so my job as the chief is to make sure we have equitable in the way that we police in these different communities, and some fairness. And so my job is to ensure that identify those leaders, and I have a great group of men and women that's in the ranks that do a great job, and I just got to applaud them for their efforts. But it's based on our policies and our procedures. We've got to continue to kind of revise what we do to do things better. So that's my 2 cents on our performance so far this year.
Good deal. Patrick Moss, Thank you so much again for joining us. You serve as a community leader and neighborhood association president. How would you rank the performance of the Montgomery Police Department as it relates to their interaction and engagement from a community standpoint, from your constituents, those to whom you serve? What grade would you give the department as relates to, again, their community engagement?
As a community leader, I would have to say that Chief Finley and his department work very.
Just hold the mic for me. I'm sorry. Thank you, sir.
As a community leader, I would have to say that Chief Finley and his department work very closely with our community. We meet monthly, and Chief Finley or maybe 2-3 other his officers are there every month we meet. So they are always in our neighborhood. They do walkthroughs and all that. And I will say that we are a small community, but they are always present.
Okay. Mr. Moss, let me stay with you just for a moment, and let's stay in the lane of community policing. When we talk about, or when you hear the term community policing, what does that term mean to you?
I would say that you have officers that are familiar with that particular community. And back when I was younger, growing up, we pretty much had the same officers on all shifts that was inside our community. And they knew us, we knew them, and worked very good. Plus them being engaged, coming out, interacting with the neighborhood. That's what I look for a lot of.
Okay. Pastor Walker, Brother Moss just mentioned the police being engaged. What does that look like, and what does that mean to you?
I think it will mean, and first off, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak, be on this panel of great, wonderful participants. But I think it would mean more or less that we know their names, they know us, they know our ideologies to some type of facet or some type of degree, to whereas when things or infractions occur, that they know that's not something that that young man would do, or maybe they need to look further or see what the greater issue might be, especially when we're in a place now where there's a lot of mental illness running rampant in our lands, to whereas we know people enough to respond the correct way, and be able to, I guess, know what type of force is necessary in that situation.
Okay. Pastor Nettles, I want to come back to you because you have spoken quite a lot throughout the years about partnering and been really an advocate of partnering with police departments and the city as a whole as relates to this idea of community policing. You being one of those who you have your gray hat, so got a lot of wisdom there. Tell us, when you hear the term community policing, what does that mean to you both today, but you also referenced earlier that you've seen, again, what that looks like in times past. Talk more about that.
Thank you, Pastor Bird. Well, it's exactly what Mr. Moss said. Community policing is centered around housing officers in high crime areas around the clock. And the community get to know the officer get to not only know the children, but the parents. And there's a great interaction there, a great interaction. And see, if you do community policing from 8 to 5, I'm smart enough to know your office hours. So I figured out what time you come in, what time you go out, and then I'll come out of the house. But if you're there around the clock and they know you're there, and you can build those relationships through basketball, out playing basketball with them, football, whatever, not so much as I'm going to arrest you, but help me understand your culture, because a lot of times people have told me, since I've retired, my voice has elevated some, But as I shared with you, as an African American, just because we're loud or we raise our voice doesn't mean we're angry. It's like what I discussed with you, is that growing up, we played spades. And because I yelled and screamed, you know, if I had that card, I'd kick the chair over and slam it down. But it doesn't mean I'm angry because I elevated my voice and I'm passionate about what I'm saying, you know. So it's important for that to happen, you know. I don't know if it's a manpower issue for Montgomery or what, you know, and I'm not trying to suggest to the chief anything, but that's what community policing looks like to me. You know, you're growing up with those children, they're respecting you, they'll pass that on to the next generation, that officer so-and-so, if you get in trouble, whatever, or something going on wrong, you have a friend in officer so-and-so and so. Thank you.
Pastor Eisner, I want to come to you next because there are many who suggest that community policing should require officers to live in the communities that they police. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a good question. I remember having a conversation with a bunch of other clergy in Minneapolis, where I was before I moved here, and I lived in a sort of an urban, diverse, poor, somewhat tough neighborhood in Minneapolis, and so that was a live conversation in my neighborhood, and we were talking with the chief of police, and what the question that came to the thing that he talked about was that one of his challenges was not just having officers live in the neighborhoods, but also having officers from the neighborhoods. He was having this like recruitment problem where a bunch of, frankly, like white guys from the suburbs, exurbs, smaller towns north of the city sort of like thought about what urban policing was about based on what they saw in Law and Order or Cops or whatever. And they would come into these communities like where I lived and imagine they were just going to come sort of run roughshod and kick butt and take names, and it was this sort of like warrior mentality, not community protector mentality. And I remember one of them, I was like in my alley, and this dude sort of walking up and was like, you know, I was like, hey, what's going on, sir? And he said, oh, we're just sort of like looking for someone, you know, someone who we're going to bust for, I think it was drugs or whatever. And then he was walking past and he said, stopped at me and was like, hey, just so you know, and it was a white guy, if you ever see anything, don't hesitate to say anything. Because like I know there are things that you should be scared of. And it was very clearly sort of like, hey, if your black neighbor scares you, it's fine, be scared of him and tell us about it. Which was not conducive to a kind of community relationship where I felt like my black neighbors were going to be treated safe by this guy. And so I was like, all right, sir, thank you very much. Would that have helped if the gentleman who was in an alley with me lived in the community and like knew my black neighbors as well as I did? Maybe. I think so. If he had come from, if there were more people who had come from that neighborhood who were on the police force, would that help? Probably. I would also say that the chief of police also said it was a recruitment issue, but also like a culture of policing issue, where there was a sense of like, how are we as police officers engaging with these communities? Are we seeing them as threats? Or are we seeing them as fellow partners in community protection? And I could imagine how you could build that kind of a culture where, you know, people sort of live in whatever is best for their kids, you know, the football team or whatever. But it probably would help if the people saw the people they were policing as neighbors. And however you get to that, neighbors as opposed to adversaries, however you get to that is what I'd advocate for.
Deal. Attorney Smith, I want to ask you a question as relates, again, Pastor Eisner brought up this idea of racial contempt, if you will, but then also perhaps even racial biases. In your line of work, do you believe either within yourself or even the clients that you have the opportunity to work with, do you believe that there's racial and or other biases within policing here, specifically in the city of Montgomery?
So because I believe that racial biases exist across the board. I do believe in systemic racism. Then I have to say yes, because not because I know someone specifically on the Montgomery Police Department that holds those types of beliefs, but because you just have to look at it's a numbers thing. It's what's happening all across America. It's the history of America, and so if we know our history and we understand that this is very deep rooted, these are beliefs that are hard to eradicate, as we can see, then we must believe that there are racial biases among the police officers that are on the MPD.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn our attention now to the topic of police training. Chief Finley, you brought that up just a moment ago, and so I want to go back and just ask questions around that. According to a recent Pew Research poll, 71% of those surveyed strongly agree that police officers should be trained in non-violent alternatives to deadly force. Does Montgomery Police Department agree with this thought, and what does the MPD have in place for both new recruits as well as continual training for tenured officers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Thanks for bringing that up. And I do believe that's a good question, and thanks for bringing that up, Pat. I do believe in continuous training, and that's part of that initiative for us in the first 9 months of this year. And so I kind of, when the young lady, I didn't get her name, was talking, I just kind of jot down implicit bias sensitivity training, because that's, she's absolutely correct. And so that's why we have identified that particular training, just to deal with those biases that we all have. And so regardless of what side of the border you come from, in terms of communities you come from, you're going to have something that you have to deal with. And part of that sensitivity training that applied by training, cultural and diversity training, we're going to talk about those issues. So we have developed that this year. Starting in I believe January 2021, that's going to be a part of the state mandate as well. So we're talking about not only MPD officers, but statewide, they're going to have that cultural diversity bias training that I think is very important. So when we talk about the alternative to use of force and things of that nature, I think what's important, again, to have those discussions on training, shoot, don't shoot, but also different ways on how do we de-escalate a situation. So part of that, that new curriculum coming up, but we have already started that, is de-escalation as well. To have those type of conversation, not only written and documented, but also practical as well. And so we are in the process of having additional training for all of the sworn officers, to have some additional 2 to 3 hour block of training to deal with de-escalating the situation, but also how do we safely control the situation where we have to go hands-on, as opposed to alternative that's going to the taser or going to the 9mm. And so that's just part of that discussion that we have to ensure that the whole department is trained, including our rookies. And so moving forward in 2020, we have developed some internal training as well, and it's called our career development. With our career development cadre of about 5 officers, I believe, 4 to 5 officers, but we do have some contract employees as well that will come and train on different issues and concerns that's dealing with our police department, to make sure that we have first aid training, ensure that we have implied bias training, as well as use of force training. So that is part of the bigger picture. When you talk about 8 Can't Wait, we already hit all the blocks on that prior to 8 Can't Wait. So we are constantly training, but the more the better. And so that's why we developed that career development unit, to make sure internally we don't have to go outside the house. We can do it internally. That is mandated with the state as well.
Thank you so much, Chief. Speaking of internal versus external, there is concern, growing concern, really around the nation about police officers being able to police themselves, or the question related to that. Just by a show of hands, I want to poll kind of the panelists real quickly, and if you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, that's fine also. But how many of you would be in favor of developing a citizens review board? Now, let me tell you what that is. Many communities are developing these boards, which really is designed to give civilians both the power and the oversight to investigate and discipline officers accused of inappropriate use of force or other misconduct. How many of you would be in favor of developing a citizens review board here in the city of Montgomery? Okay. Pastor Eisner, tell me, why did you raise your hand?
Because accountability is a beautiful thing, man. I think of Jesus saying, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And I think part of being a pastor is that I believe my job is that we all fall short and are in need of grace and mercy and justice. And so providing police officers an opportunity and the community opportunity to think that we can be in an accountable relationship, as opposed to one where, like, you've got the gun, you've got the power, and yes, sir, I do what you say. Like, man, that just feels really disempowering, particularly if I'm imagining, shoot, let me get real. If my son gets shot, and I have a black child, and he gets shot, I really want to know that there is a process in place that I can trust, that it was done in a way that is not because some power-hungry fool was trying to, it was being violent in a way that we should expect differently. And if I want that, I should want that for my neighbors too. And that's not to say anything in any way like disparaging towards those who protect and serve right now, because I would imagine that it's a really hard job, and to know that you have that extra layer of accountability, that as long as it's set up in such a way that it can be trusted by the person who goes before that their concerns, their voice will be heard too, then I feel like then you're just building a relationship of mutual trust. And that's the deficit here, man. Like, when communities trust police, that's when violence goes down. There's like studies that show that worldwide. And if we can build institutions and processes where trust is built both ways, which include things like we're going to hold you accountable, and vice versa, then I think then you're building in the thing that's going to keep our kids safe. And to me, that's where it hits.
Good deal. Ms. Moss, were you wanting to say something related to that point?
Well, I couldn't agree one way or the other without knowing how this board will become into existence. What would be the makeup of it? Who would appoint? Who would serve on this board? Without that, I couldn't say one way or the other.
Thank you. And that certainly is a fair assessment. I think our question is, before we can even get to those, particulars, the idea of whether or not a board should be formed or not is a question that many around the nation is raising the question and stating that, yes, a board should be formed. Okay. Pastor Walker, let me come to you next. Pastor Eisner brings up, I think, a very fair point as relates to accountability. And so it is believed that a failure to hold police officers accountable perpetuates the national tolerance for violence against people of color specifically. Do you believe that police departments have done enough to hold police officers accountable to excessive violence?
To be totally and brutally honest, I would say no in some places. I think that's where the Citizen Review Board comes in. And I, like my brother who just spoke, I have some issues concerning credentials and things of that nature. I think with the arising of social media and the relationship that we all as individuals have with social media, that's primarily where we get our news. That's primarily where we learn what's going on. And unfortunately, sometimes what is posted, it's more emotional than it is truth. as well as sometimes what the news posts. It supports their propaganda versus what the truth is. So, of course, from my standpoint, I would say no. I think there are other points and other perspectives for certain, though.
Good deal. Thank you. Dr. Hicks, you've waited patiently. Let me bring you into the conversation. Pastor Walker just mentioned social media, and oftentimes we access social media by way of our cell phones. Cell phone footage over the past decade really has heightened the awareness of police brutality and police killings, specifically of unarmed Black and brown people in this country. What impact, if any, has this had on the mental health of those who make up our nation?
Yeah, I appreciate being a part of this panel. So, I have a public health lens. I work for the health department. And one of the things that's really important is the impact on someone's mental health when they witness any type of trauma. And one of the concepts that I think is important to talk about is something called adverse childhood experiences. All right. And there's been studies going back for years that look at those things that are internal into your household and how those have impacts on your mental state. So, for example, if you witness physical abuse, or are you emotionally neglected, if you there's substance abuse in your household, those things are considered adverse childhood events. But then they went further and they said, well, who do we study on these type of adverse childhood events, and how do we get this data? And they looked at it and they said, well, it was middle class and upper class white individuals that really all our data was about. And then in a group in Philadelphia said, let's challenge that and let's look a little deeper. And so they said there's some expanded things that you have to think about, and these are more community facing things. So if you witness violence, if you deem your neighborhood to be unsafe, or you have experience with racism, those also have adverse effects, all right? And so if you are witnessing something on social media or something on the news and you see the violence, that does something to your psyche. You cannot get that out of your head. And so if you repeatedly see that imagery, or you witness things in your community, in addition to what you're already experiencing in your own household, right? Those traumatic things, that then increases the risk of mental illness, substance abuse, potentially increased risk of criminal behavior or riskier behaviors, right? It also has other health impacts. So they've done studies that show there's increased risk of obesity and diabetes when you have those adverse experiences. So we have to really be careful about how those images are impacting communities, and that stuff subconsciously just worked on you for years and years and years. And then you get that group think, where then you have collectively, you're having everybody in a whole different mental space. And then you have the issue of when you have an engagement with law enforcement, you're already at almost a competitive disadvantage emotionally, mentally. And then you bring that into the scene, and how does that play into impact what the law enforcement has to deal with on their other end? So there's two sides to this, and a lot of these things are either stuff that's in the home or within the community that we have to address. Those are those deep social, we call them social determinants of health, the environment you're in, how in experiences you've had in life.
Good deal. I want to stay with you, Dr. Hicks. Research shows that police killings of unarmed people of color are responsible for more than 50 million additional days of poor mental health per year among Black Americans. This mental health burden is comparable to that associated with diabetes, a disease that strikes 1 in 5 Black Americans. Medically speaking, is police brutality a public health issue that we're facing in America?
Yes, it is. Yeah, so in public health, we're looking at the whole society, and anything that contributes to increased disease burden, mental health, increased death rates, increase in diabetes, obesity, those chronic diseases, that's a public health issue. And the root cause is these deep things that usually we don't want to address. We do the low-lying fruit, right? So how is the education system? How is access to gainful employment, right? Look at all those things undergird a lot of issues that we have in society. Then you layer on top the systemic racism, institutional racism, and that just sets us up for failure. There's actually something interesting. There's something called John Henryism syndrome, right? And so there was this real person named John Henry who had high blood pressure, and he ended up dying as a result of it. And they looked back in his life history, and they found out that he had to struggle a lot in life. He really fought against the system and the challenges, and he developed a high level of resiliency, and he fought through everything, but that led to increased inflammation in his arteries in his body and caused him to die. And so there's this thing where particularly people of color have to fight and struggle so much. You have physical manifestations in your body. So you have mental, you have physical, you have increased stress hormones in your body that wears down on your body. So all this stuff is all interconnected. We can't just take out one piece from the other. And then we also have substance abuse. Right now, we're in a COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing higher rates of substance abuse in the communities, higher levels of domestic violence. What is that doing, particularly to our young people, and as they're witnessing these things, and everything else we talked about? So that's kind of my short answer to just, it's a really difficult question to ask, but there's definitely physical and mental impacts to witness violence, personally experience violence.
Good deal. Thank you. Chief Finley, I want to come back to you and ask a question. There's a well-respected organization that provides legal representation and support that recently posted on their website, I quote, "The deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd make clear that when racism is shielded with a badge and immunity, made more dangerous with a gun and the authority to kill, policing becomes a source of danger and threat rather than a solution. Do you believe that policing in Montgomery in its current state is a threat to or solution toward helping build a better Montgomery?"
I'll get back to that. So I think that it's we're working towards a better solution. Just the things that we do: slow down, assess, de-escalate, have more communication. Part of some of the discussions or questions that I heard early today dealt with community policing. I think Pastor Nettles mentioned something, and back in the day, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, they had the weed and seed unit. I think that's he was alluding to that, where they was out in these communities and it really made a difference where they had the proper funding and things of that nature. So I think that since I've been here going on 6 years, one of the things that I stress is that philosophy of engagement, that philosophy of get to know, and it's not perfect, but we're making some strides in that. Where we can kind of slow down and try to figure things out as opposed to everybody go to jail. And so a lot of things that we're going to be the enforcers out here. That's part of what we do. But what we try to do is try to get the right people. Not everybody in this community have that label that on the west side, south side, or whatever part of the city is all bad. We want to identify those individuals that need to go to jail. And with the probable cause and the due diligence, place them in jail. But so the way I look at this whole process and the way that we police in Montgomery is that we're going to try to do it right as best as possible. We're going to understand the dynamics that we have. We have made some progress in terms of identifying officers, and we have like 4 officers that work communities for about 90 days, about 3 months. And so this to get back into that philosophy to get to know the family, get to know the children, get to know the dynamics in that community. So we saw a reduction in one community of 38% reduction in crime. We go into another community, a challenged community as well. And so to do that same concept, just slow down. Try to get to know the community, try to enforce what we need to enforce by bringing other resources there, but also trying to bring right resources to those communities to get them the help. Because some of the quality of life issues, it's not a crime. It's more, they may need some assistance. So we're gonna find those resources out there to provide that assistance. The other thing that I have to talk about when Dr. Hicks was talking about police brutality as a public health issue, I put that in the same boat as violent crime. But when we talk about putting that category on a public health issue, we look at funding. And I think that we don't have the funding that's attached to smoking, to opioids, to COVID-19. I think he's absolutely correct. And so when we look at those things that he mentioned, violence, racism, poor neighborhoods, angry, trauma for our victims of crime, we need that. And so I think the push will be from the community and everybody to make that a public health issue. And I think that we have to get the government support. We have to get the colleges and university, because that's the funding that needs to help us out. But I think that hit all those indicative indicators there, and I agree with them on that. As far as we got to reach out to these communities, we got to provide them the specialized training that they need. When we talk about a young child or a family member experiencing what they see what they see. And so they're going to live that PTSD over and over again. In these underserved communities, they're not getting the help that they need. And so again, funding to make sure the resources available is the way to go. So,
Good deal. Chief, let me stay with you just real quickly, because you just talked about resources and making sure that people are getting the help that they need. Studies show that more incarceration does not reduce violent crime. Using prisons to deal with poverty and mental illness makes these problems worse by many accounts. People leave overcrowded and violent jails and prisons, it is believed, more traumatized, mentally ill, and physically battered than when they went in. Reports show that a significant number of individuals who encounter police officers may suffer from both diagnosed and undiagnosed mental health issues. What training, if any, does the MPD receive to help interact appropriately with such individuals?
well, you know, we partner up with the state mental health, also with NAMI, also with Montgomery County Sheriff Department, that in partnership with NAMI train our officers, what we call crisis intervention teams. And so that really kind of helped us out in terms of dealing with the mental health issues of people in crisis. The other training that we have, I think we have trained over 200 some officers this recently dealing with mental health first aid. And I think that's kind of a segue into CIT training as well. And so those CIT training, bringing awareness, autism awareness, all those type of awareness training that we are embarking on will help us out tremendously. We are in the process, I think this week, Tuesday or Wednesday, we will do a push out with our mobile CIT training team. And their job, at a minimum of 4 to 6 hours a day, be on call, is to go out to those communities, respond to calls, either from our mental health service providers or a call from service to deal with people in crisis, to deal with the homeless and things of that nature. So I think that we're on the right track. I think that we do understand that a lot of our communities are in crisis one way or the other, and we have to make sure that the trained officer is the right face to deal with these individuals that are in crisis, and I think that's very important. And so I'm very proud of our staff to really get out there starting this week, is to be that trendsetter, that tip of the spear, to really engage our communities that need our help. The last thing that I would say on that note is that partnership with these service providers throughout. We're talking about COSA, we're talking about Mid-Atlanta a coalition for the homeless. We're talking about anybody that want to partner up with us to deal with that underserved, that population in crisis. We want to be that true partner with those organizations.
Thank you. Attorney Smith, you just heard Dr. Hicks talk about police brutality certainly being a public health issue. There is a legal doctrine known as qualified immunity, which I understand is designed to generally protect officers from being held personally liable in lawsuits unless they commit clear violations of the law. A recent survey conducted by Pew Research shows that 2/3 of Americans, 66%, say that civilians need to have the power to sue police officers to hold them accountable for misconduct and excessive use of force, even if it makes the officer's job difficult. Do you believe that doing away with qualified immunity will help or hurt the policing here in Montgomery?
Okay, so let me start by saying that I don't have an opinion one way or the other on this subject. You're asking me my personal opinion about qualified immunity. But this is what I will say. I think qualified immunity has a place in our legal system, but it's the way that it's applied. It's not necessarily the doctrine itself, it's the way that it's being applied in various cases. And so, sometimes you're in a more conservative district when this doctrine is usually, it usually takes place in federal court. And so we know with our federal court system, we have judges that lean one way, and then we have judges that lean more to a conservative viewpoint. And so sometimes we find that this doctrine of qualified immunity, what it does is it blocks the case from ever even being heard by a jury. And that's sort of taking away from a person's ability to get their problems redressed in our legal system. And so I do think that there needs to be some level of change to qualified immunity, although I haven't made up my mind as to whether or not I think it needs to be completely eradicated. But I want to make sure that people understand when we talk about qualified immunity, this is not something that occurs in a criminal context. Oftentimes when we have these police brutality cases, there are two different cases that are happening, sometimes simultaneously. Other times the criminal case will play out first, and then typically the civil case will come after that. And qualified immunity only takes place in the civil context. It is not applicable in the criminal system. Those defenses are usually, in police brutality cases, self-defense. So I just wanted to make that clear. People throw around this term qualified immunity like everybody understands what that means, and we don't.
Good deal. Let me stay with you, Attorney Smith. In 2018, black males ages 18 to 19 were 12.7 times as likely to be imprisoned as white males in the same age group. The highest black to white racial disparity of any age group for this particular reporting period in 2018. Statistics like these that highlight the extent of racial bias in policing, some would argue, make it clear for the need of police and criminal justice reform. As a person who is a part of working within the criminal justice system, do you believe that there is a need for police and criminal justice reform in our nation?
Absolutely. And so let me start by saying the criminal justice system is a lot of players involved. You have the police, our law enforcement officers, you have our prosecutors or district attorneys, you have judges, and we also have our jury system. And oftentimes what we do as people of color, we don't like jury duty. And so we go to the court, we make up excuses why we can't participate in jury duty, and then we're upset when cases play out and a grand jury doesn't indict, or a jury finds this person not guilty, and then we're upset. And so I want to point those things out because there are things that we can do as communities or people in the community to affect what's happening in our communities. Another thing is to pay attention to our district attorney races as well as judge races. In the state of Alabama, our judges are elected. And so if you can't name a judge in your community, if you don't know who your district judges are, if you don't know who your circuit judges are, that's a problem. If you don't know who you're going to the polls to vote for, if you're not voting, all of these factors play a role in our criminal justice system. And so the district attorneys play a large role. Although law enforcement officers make arrests, district attorneys make decisions about whether or not to prosecute an individual for any given crime. And so that is something, again, that we need to be paying attention to. We need to have a level of heightened awareness about, is that who is running for district attorney in your particular county. What do you know about this person? What are their philosophies on the law? What are their philosophies on criminal justice? How do they feel about that? Oftentimes we don't know this information, and we have people in place that are maybe making decisions that run opposed to our beliefs. And so to answer your question, I do think we need to have some police reform. We need to have some criminal justice reform. And I want to highlight an area where I feel like we don't get enough attention, and that's in our juvenile justice system. Because as many of the panelists have discussed, some of these issues that are resulting in criminal behavior, they start in your childhood. And so we have a juvenile justice system. And what I think we're not doing enough of, and this is my personal opinion, is we're seeing the red flags, but we're not doing enough at that young age when the red flags are starting to appear. We're not doing enough to combat those problems that we see arising. And so what happens is we create the prison, pipeline where, it's the school to prison pipeline. We start with, okay, little Johnny's getting in trouble in school, and now the school is tired of dealing with little Johnny. And so now we're in the juvenile justice system. And now little Johnny is an adult, and so little Johnny is and we're never really addressing what is little Johnny's problem. What services did we provide little Johnny when, he was 11 or 12 years old and we saw the red flags arising? That is where I feel like our system is failing, because we don't have, programs in place. We don't have things in place that are designed to sort of combat that behavior. We have programs, but in my opinion, it's not enough, and there's not enough attention paid to that, and it's not enough funding put into that system to help remedy some of those issues.
I'm glad you brought that up. I was reading earlier this week that I think it was either the last day of last month or the first day of this month, in California, Governor Gavin Newsom signed several bills into law related to criminal justice reform. And one of the bills that he signed is a bill of very soon closing down all juvenile facilities and redirecting the proceeds that are now going toward the juvenile system to going toward prevention measures to help redirect the behavior, if you will, of young people who suffer, if you will, in what many of you have talked about on tonight. I don't know that is something that here in Alabama, our legislative branch has brought up, but any thoughts around if that is, I think, a healthy approach or a healthy process, or if you think that that's a healthy approach or a healthy process for perhaps curbing some of the violence and even arrest rates that we have here in the city. Chief?
The only thing I can add what the council said is the state legislators, we need their help. And so either for or against a lot, and I just think about in the past and the way that things were perpetrated on African Americans in the past with the Jim Crow laws and all of that, that was legislated in. And so we just got to be very mindful of the who we put in office. She mentioned the DAs, and I think that she was everything that she said, I'm just taking great notes. She was spot on. But the other missing piece is that legislative support that we need to kind of help us out.
Thank you. Pastor Nettles, I want to come to you, and I want to go back. We've talked tonight a little bit about civil unrest. In 1966, there was a 60-minute interview where Dr. King said these words, and I quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard." He goes on to talk about the economic plight specifically for the black population and how it had worsened over the years back then. In current day, when the wealth gap and divide continues to widen with literally every waking moment, is America ready to hear the voices of those in poverty who engage perhaps in what is seen as criminal activity as a means to make their voices heard?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, there is a lot to unload there. First and foremost, the upper class probably would never engage lower class people in a conversation as it relates to racial inequalities and things like that. When you're making money off of them and you have your foot on them, why take your foot off when you're prospering? Okay? It's not so much as what office you hold. For me, it's not so much as how popular you are. It's how much money you have. And money is a great persuader. And so you can't expect change when someone else can buy life as usual behind the door. But I know Pastor Eisner, prior to the COVID, we were in a multi-faith group talking with bankers, real estate people about the inequality in housing here in Montgomery. I hope we will continue that conversation. But we recognize, and there are bankers here in Montgomery who recognize there has been a shortfall here in Montgomery, financing and all these other issues that I won't get in tonight. We hope to continue that discussion at some point, raising people up, you know, and even within our own culture, we are guilty, you know. I wasn't raised in Trinum Court, but that's where I played. That's where I connect to. That's why I tell everyone I'm from. That's my family, okay? God has been blessed me and elevated me in life. And guess what? I didn't forget a single one. I used to ride back every so often to see how they were doing. How can I help them? But our own people get increased, and they act like the other people. No, I never been poor. Don't connect me with my past. Your past is your blessing. So you can look back and see how good God has been to you, not to elevate you. I think a lot of our own people need to humble themselves, you know? You diss us because you got $2 more than us. I know my time is up, but my thing is, it's also a problem with us looking down on us, you know? Humble is the way. Humble is the way, you know? And so even if we're asking white people to do this, how many of us are reaching back for our brothers and sisters? How many of us are afraid of our past to let folks know where you came from? It would be a blessing to the receiver of your testimony because it gives them hope for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. Pastor Walker, I want to come to you next. Research shows that a black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped without just cause than a white person. A black man is twice as likely to be stopped without just cause than a black female. As a result, parents of black and brown children are faced with having to have a discussion, or as we commonly call the conversation, with our kids. please share your thoughts about the conversation and your thoughts on its relevance.
I will say it's unfortunate. I believe that the conversations are different in our context, in our culture, versus the other culture. But I have a son and I have a beautiful daughter, and they're nowhere close to driving, but there's still some things that they have to understand. And I think in those conversations, along with what Pastor Nettles was giving us, there's a biased perception of even us having that conversation with our children, because there's some who would just result with aggression, and there's some who would say that you're being passive if you act in a more respectful manner. But I will say, I think it's historically ingrained in us to have some type of fright whenever dealing with an officer. No matter what it is that they pull us over for, there's that guilt potentially, but there's also that fright of what's going to happen next. And I think Pastor Eisner talked about that as well, with that accountability of the Civilian Review Board, that where it basically lands in the right whatever the officer does. So that fright is there, and that conversation has to be had, unfortunately, where we have to tell people beyond their normal discipline to be respectful and things of that nature. Hey, no matter what he says, this is what you have to do. No matter how it seems you've done nothing wrong, you still have to go this particular way. So it's unfortunate, but for certain, we have to have these conversations because the truth is, it's better to have life today and to have a conversation, an argument, or at least appear before the judge tomorrow.
Good deal. Pastor Eisner, I want to come to you because earlier you mentioned that you have the blessed opportunity to father a young man who is of African American descent. And so as you hear this conversation that parents must have with their children, black and brown children, give me your thoughts on its relevance and how you have prepared or will be preparing to have that conversation with your son.
It's an ongoing one. I remember living in North Minneapolis several years ago, and it was about 11 o'clock at night, it's our neighborhood, and there was a police officer who sort of stopped outside of my house, a police car, and so I just sort of went out the door, and I was like, what's going on, Mr. Officer? Dark, lit night, tough neighborhood, and I had a hoodie on. How are you doing, sir? And he said, hi, do you live here? Yeah, I do. And he said, well, you come here. And he said, can you sit in the back of the car, please? And I'm, sure, absolutely, sounds good. Without any sort of hesitation, I'm like, I'm at my house, whatever. And he said, you live here, is anyone home? I'm like, yeah, my wife's there. And, he goes to the door and is like, is your husband home? And she was like, what did he do? I thought so. And what it ended up being is they were looking for some person who was burglarizing homes or whatever, who was wearing a hoodie. And they just seen me come out of my house and weren't sure. And the entire time I'm sitting in the back of this police car, I'm thinking, it'll be fine. This is my house. This is my neighborhood. This is, it'll be okay. And I'm aware that there are my neighbors in that same block would not have reacted with that same sense of ease, that same sense of confidence and trust, that things would work out okay because it was my house and things would be fine. I would love for my son to grow up with that same sense of trust in his community, trust in those who are entrusted with protecting and serving in his community. I am told by my black and brown sisters and brothers, children of God, that I would be naive of me as a white parent of a black child to just assume, or just let him assume that his experience is going to be my experience. And so I'd just be utterly naive. And so I feel like I come to the conversation as someone who, it comes to learning a second language. And what I've learned in sort of learning sort of broken Spanish is that when I want to communicate to someone in a second language, I've really got to be clear about exactly what I need to know and what the questions I need to know about what it is, about their experience. It needs to be communicated so that we can communicate effectively. What I've heard, therefore, is two messages really quickly that I try to instill in my son and that we're going to continue to have conversations about. One, Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago put out a video several years ago that talked about get home safely. And what do you need to do? Here are the 7 or 8 steps you need to do, get home safely. And so that's part of the conversation we have. And then the conversation of respect. Be disciplined in your heart, show respect, not because it's perfect, but because that's what you need to do, son, to get home safely. And I think that's what I've been taught. And there's obviously a whole lot more that, frankly, I'm just anxious to learn about.
Thank you. Mr. Moss, I want to come to you because Pastor Eisner just talked about the video about getting home safely. Freddie Gray is believed to have followed all of the instructions of the officer. Sandra Bland was in custody of the police department when misfortune befell her. As a community leader, what else can be done, in your opinion, when the conversation seemingly has been complied with, and yet the outcome doesn't necessarily work out the way that we would like for it to? What advice would you give to young people in the community in which you serve?
Well, first I'm going to tell you, I have 3 sons. I have a 37, 24, and an 18. I often conversate with my sons. I tell them, know who you're with when you're out, know where you're going when you're out, and try to do the right thing when you're out. Now, back to what you were saying about that, I don't know a lot about those cases. I heard about them, I hadn't been into them, so I can't really give you an answer on a lot of that stuff. But I can go back to you about young black males in the street. Like I said, I have 3 sons. Trouble is out there. We can raise our kids, and they can be the best kids at home. But we got to pray and hope that we taught them enough when they get out into the world that they're going to stick by our teachings. I retired from the prison system, 22 and a half years. First went work in the prison system in 1987. It was very rare you see a young black kid, or white kid, come to penitentiary. 16 years to 17 years old. When I left there in 2006, that was all there. Some went very wrong in those years. And we can't just put it all on the police or our kids out on the street and they arrested them in some penitentiary. A lot of that we got to do ourselves as parents. We got to take control. We can't put it all on the police. We got to take some control of these kids and bring them home and teach them what's right and what's wrong. That's what I can tell you.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. You give me a great segue into our wrap-up questions. We have about 10 minutes left before we close our discussion down for tonight. Chief Finley, I want to come back to you because Mr. Moss raises a great point of not only accountability for our police officers, but accountability within our communities, and more specifically, accountability within our homes. And so as the top cop, if you will, here in the city as the police chief, how do you see us partnering to help build better bridges between the police department and the communities here in Montgomery?
Go back to right here. The forum right here and any other forums that we have. It's all about communication and to have those tough discussions. And so, I'm just listening and I always, take my little notes, but it's a check and balance. And the hearing on some of these stops that police officers make on black and brown young men and women out here, it's almost like a throwing the dice. You know, what type of officer is that child is going to encounter that day, and that shouldn't be. You know, because if we train properly to deal with those issues, they should be about a respect thing, but it's not. And so I was listening to Pastor Eisner talk, and he was, because he was a white male. Imagine if he was a black male with the hoodie and question, why are you stopping me? Why are you questioning me? And maybe said a 4-letter word. You know, again, it's almost like Freddie Gray, is that they're going to take advantage of that brother and take the long route to the precinct and to have that conversation with that individual that was in front of his home. And so, again, it's that checks and balance. And what I mean by that, really, is that that's internal within our organization, that we treat people with respect each and every day. And if that officer, man or woman, get out of line, say something that's questionable, his courtesy, the way that he approached a citizen, we got to have some conversation. And again, that's easy said than done. But when we talk about that duty to intervene, something has to resonate within the organization. When we talk about that thin blue line, something has to change, because we don't want to be that city. I don't want to be that city. And so that's why at every opportunity, somebody in my organization is going to be somewhere talking real talk about how we do things differently and how we're going to work on trying to bridge that gap. Because I think that is something that we have to continuously fight that fight, have that discussion, and really eat crow when we have to. If we're wrong, we call it. We say it. We're wrong, but this is what we're going to do better, and have those checks and balances out there, have that accountability out there, and that transparency. So we're working to do a lot of wrongs that policing or we have done in the past, to do things the right way. And so that's just work in progress each and every day. But I really applaud you to have this tough conversation. But we need more of those tough conversations in these other communities throughout the city of Montgomery.
Chief Finley, one closing question for you. I wanted to go back here, and you made reference to this idea of the thin blue line. What have you instituted, if anything, in your department to ensure that officers feel comfortable that if they see fellow officers performing in a manner that is not representative of the culture that you speak of on tonight, that they can speak up without fear of being retaliated against?
And again, that is a challenge. And, you know, I'd be a fool to say it's not. But the Montgomery has a unique situation with the city investigations, and they are autonomous from us, and they work autonomous from the city government. And so we encourage, see something, say something, with citizens, or as well as the police officers, to kind of, you know, let them know, and they will thoroughly investigate that if they get that information about misconduct. The other thing that we look at when we talk about our new policy, duty to intervene, we just changed that. It was supervisors, but it's for officers. So that means the whole department. And I just recently got some information on that, and we dealt with that officer immediately. When we talk about see something, say something, without any retaliation, and that's work in progress. And I think those couple officers, I'm not going to just kind of pinpoint it, they will see the results of that, because it's the right thing to do. And part of what I say every day on my my conference call is be safe and follow policy. And I do believe in that. If you do the right thing, and you constantly believe in integrity and what this oath of office is about, it's going to become easy. But it's work in progress, and this new social reform that we have right now throughout the country, it's way overdue. and we are part of those changes. And we just want to be that department that attempts to do the right thing each and every day, and that's what we're going to strive for.
And you mentioned earlier the health issue that we know that we are facing in our country as relates to the interactions between the community and the police. What would you say as a final thought for us to consider as relates to building a healthier partnership so that we can build healthier mental and even physical lives as relates to the community and the police partnership?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to each side understanding the place where the other person is coming from, right? So if you're in law enforcement, having that additional training and understanding that as you're approaching someone in a certain community, what were all the things that has impacted their worldview and their perceptions, and be sensitive to those things. So as you're interacting, that person may be a little more on edge, more anxious, nervous, and don't look at that and as if it's maybe challenging your authority as much as you probably think it would be. And then learn how to communicate through that, learn how to de-escalate the situation, learn about how the tone that you use can be received by one group versus another group. And then for the community and the citizen has to realize how do you safely engage with the law enforcement so that you can get out and survive that situation if it was something that's, that you were concerned about. But you have to learn how to respect the authority. And if you still have some issues, there's a way and a venue to do that after the fact, right? And so if both sides understand how to engage each other in a different way, then we don't have to be set up for this crucible where there's so much tension there, and it's just one thing that's said a certain way or one action leads to something bad happening, and then we can have those conversations. Then I think the other thing is and we talked about this earlier, is really starting young in those interactions. I'll give you one just story. My brother and his family, the back of their house got ripped off by a tornado, okay, in another state. And law enforcement came, first responders came, and did a phenomenal job, okay? So my nephew said, and that was his first real interaction with law enforcement, and his birthday just came up, and he said he wants to have a police birthday, because that was what he saw. These are the heroes that came in and saved the day. So my brother calls the police department. He'd already been engaging with them, and the whole unit came. About 5 police cars came and did a drive-by celebration. And at the end of that, my nephew said, "I want to be a police officer." So you can get from that interaction then to someone witnessing a violent situation or something on social media, and that can completely change your view. So I think it has to start young, and you build those relationships in the community where it's not always, it's not that view that I have to be defensive all the time. It's too late almost for me, because if I get pulled over, I don't care what my title is, I don't care what car I'm driving, my blood pressure goes up and I'm sweating, I'm anxious because of past experiences. So we just start young, and so we can repair these relationships for generations to come.
Thank you, sir. And finally, Ms. Attorney Ashley Smith, I'll give you the final word for tonight. As you think about building better bridges and better partnerships, again, you work with many who are charged, if you will, but you also, again, do have an opportunity to work, again, with those within law enforcement as well. What are your thoughts on how we build better bridges of strengthening the relationships between our law enforcement and our communities?
So I think it's Dr. Hicks. He just hit the nail on the head when he said the interaction between the police and his nephew, that wasn't the police coming out responding to a call. It wasn't the police coming out to de-escalate some tense situation. It was just an interaction when the police officers were coming out to help. And so I think just personally, I just played in a softball game Friday with my church versus MPD, and by the way, I have to mention that we did win, True Divine. We did win the game. But those types of interactions where the community has an opportunity to interact with the police, and it's not a hostile situation, and it's not the police are coming out to do their job. It's just the police are out in the community. I think that's an element of the community policing that we've been talking about. And so I think if we can increase those types of interactions between the police and between people in the community, so that the only interaction you have with a police officer should not be when the police officer comes out and, there's a crisis situation happening, or there's a crime taking place, or there's a tense situation going on. That should not be your only interaction with the police. And if that is your only interaction with the police, then it may result in those feelings, as he mentioned earlier, of blood pressure going up, just you're nervous. And so because in your experience, you've had far more negative experiences with the police than you have had positive experiences. And so I think we need to work on creating those sort of positive experiences, so that that's not the only thing that's in your mind when you get, when you encounter a law enforcement officer.
Thank you so much. Just for the record, Pastor Huntley, a great friend of ours, you all may have a little advantage because he's very skilled in baseball. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Well, Pastor Huntley did not even play, but go ahead.
All right then, moving right along. Mr. Moss, let me say thank you so much for joining us on tonight. Attorney Smith, to you, thank you. Pastor Nettles, thank you. Pastor Eisner, thank you. Dr. David Hicks, thank you. And Pastor Lee Walker, thank you. And certainly to you, Chief Finley, thank you so much for joining us on tonight. To all of you that have joined us, whether it is on our Facebook channel it's on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, let me say a very special thank you to each and every one of you. Chief Finley, I think, shared some very encouraging news, and he challenged us to not stop having the conversations, but to continue those conversations, whether it's here in the capital city, or we recognize that so many of you may be watching us from literally around the world. So wherever you're watching us, we challenge you and we encourage you to have these conversations, continue to have dialogue. I think what we've learned here tonight is that when you can talk to each other, you learn a lot of things, and it can certainly perhaps combat and even break down barriers that sometimes have been built. So our challenge to you is to help build stronger bridges between you who represent the community as well as you who represent our law enforcement. We believe, and we say it all the time, that apart we can do nothing, but together we can accomplish great things. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us for this crucial discussion, policing in the capital city. God bless you and have a great night.